Hello and welcome to this virtual workshop on working with the RGS IBG collections. My name is Sarah Evans and I work in the Research and Higher Education team here at the Society. So if you've never done archival work, it can be a bit daunting to think about where to begin. You might think of archives as places that are particularly difficult to access, that might not have relevant material, that might be a bit dry and dusty, or are just not going to give you the stories that you're interested in about the people that you want to find out more about. What I would like to do in this workshop is show you a bit more about demystifying archives, show you a bit more about what they actually are, the kind of things they contain, and get you starting to think about how you might be able to use them for your own projects and your own research, whether that's for a dissertation or further down the line. So we're going to be demystifying archives a little bit today. And what I'm going to be doing is using some examples from research that I did myself on the collections, looking at women's involvement in RGS-supported expeditions in the early to mid-20th century. Then, as now, the RGS supported expeditionary work for expeditions going around the world and working on a range of different topics. Part of my research was just finding out which of those expeditions had women on, which was not always the easiest task. For the period that I looked at, women were often formally excluded from opportunities for education or for research. A lot of universities in this period did not admit women to degrees until well on into the 20th century, and social norms often meant that women had to give up paid work or employment outside the home once they married. Particularly middle class or upper class women. The situation was often different for working class women, of course. So reflecting this often marginalised position, women's participation in society activities can often be a bit buried within the sources, particularly compared with some of their male colleagues. What I want to do in this workshop is show you how I followed one of these trails through the archives to find out more about a particular expedition and a particular woman on that expedition, and give you a sense of how you can follow that kind of trail through the sources for a project of your own. So, archives are always put together for a particular person. They reflect the biases and the values of the people and the organisations that put them together. The Royal Geographical Society archives and collections are no exception. They reflect the reality of the RGS as a colonial organisation that was predominantly white, male and upper class. To give you a bit of a sense of the society at that time, in particular the time I was studying over 80 years ago, I'm filming this in the council room. This is the most traditional room here at the Society. And you can see that kind of from what's behind me in terms of the globes, the portraits on the walls and so on. The portraits that you can see behind me and in other parts of this video are of early medalists of the Society, and they really reinforce how many of those medalists and much of the organisation was very male dominated, very white and very upper class. You can see that in terms of the absences of women from this space, the absence of black and minority ethnic geographers, and you can get a sense of the class disparities by looking at what they're wearing in the portraits behind me. In this workshop, I'd also like to show you how you can start to think about how those kind of absences are reflected in the archives and in the materials that you would be looking at. I'd also want to show you how we can start to recover some of these marginalised and underrepresented groups and people. So you've decided you'd like to do some archival research, you think it's relevant for your project, and you've identified an archive or collection that you think is going to have some useful material for you. And your tutors can often help you with these first steps. The best place to go next is to look and see if the organisation in question has got an online catalogue that you can look at before you visit in person. This will often have a lot of more information about the details of the items that they have available that would be relevant for you to see. So for the Society's catalogue, the majority of our catalogue is now available online through the Society's website, which means that you can browse it to find out more about the materials that we have here and start thinking about why they might be relevant for your research. And depending on your project, there might also be some core resources that will be definitely relevant, such as some of the more formal or official or key records of the organisation, like the document that I'm about to show you now. For my project, I was looking for details of expeditions that had women on the expedition team. So during my research, I read through books and books of the council and committee minutes for the organisation for the period that I was looking at. And I've got one of those minute books in front of me here. So these are very formal documents. They record the decisions taken at these meetings. So again, these are the formal governing bodies of the organisation. So it's a record of the meetings, it captures any decisions that were taken, and they're very formal documents. They're also not publicly available at the time that they're created. These are confidential documents which are relevant to the running of the organisation. This that I have in front of me is a council minute book from the mid-1930s. And I've got this one out for a particular reason. This particular page that I've got it open to is quite unusual in terms of finding women in the expedition archives. So I've got it open to an entry where they're talking about an application from the Wager brothers for an expedition to East Greenland in 1935. And it's unusual because it mentions the fact that women were going to be on the team right here in the formal documents. That usually doesn't happen during this period unless it's a woman leading the team, like somebody like Gertrude Caton-Thompson or Gertrude Bell, both of whom are stories for another day. In this section of the minutes here, they talk about how the Wager brothers were planning to take their wives with them on expedition. That is, there are British women taking part in the expedition and overwintering in Greenland as part of the team. So usually when British women are accompanying their husbands or other male relatives or male colleagues on expeditions where they're not the leader of the expedition, they don't get a mention in these formal documents in the council minutes. What you have to do then is to go to other sources. And what I'm going to do next is show you some of those other sources that I use to track this expedition further. So the Society publishes a journal, the Geographical Journal, which we still publish today, throughout this period. And it serves as an official record of the Society's activities, expeditions and projects that they were supporting, the latest geographical news that they thought would be relevant to their readers, and so on. What it also does, very usefully, is print the text of any lectures that had been given at the Society, and particularly on that were reporting back on expeditions that they had supported. So we have a lecture in this journal article, so this is from early 1937, where we have a lecture by Lawrence Wager, one of the Wager brothers who I just mentioned, talking about the results of the expedition to Greenland. And again, this one's a bit unusual because in the recorded discussion after the lecture, we actually get a speech by one of the British women on the expedition, Phyllis Wager, who was married to Lawrence. This is unusual. We don't usually get to hear from these women in their own voices. Normally, when you're looking at these kind of sources, it's a one-liner to say, Mrs. So-and-so was on the expedition. They might say she was the expedition doctor. They might say that she was helping with the support work. Sometimes they don't even go into that level of detail. So this is a really rich resource for finding out a bit more what Phyllis thought about her experiences on the expedition. What you can also do is look at what we call secondary literature, or things that were published later. So this is a biography of Lawrence Wager, which talks about his time on the Greenland expedition, along with other expeditions he was involved in the Arctic and on Mount Everest. And we also, fascinatingly, we also have a memoir by Phyllis, which is self-published in the early 2000s. So it's a really rich resource about her reminiscences, as you can see on the title, and her experiences on this expedition. But the really key thing about using these sources is that now we have a name. Often with the online catalogues that I talked about earlier, they are very literal. They're not really great for thematic tagging. They are about the names of people and the names of places. Once you have a name of somebody you want to find out more about, you're set. You can start using the catalogues to find materials, which is going to bring us to possibly my favourite item in the collections. So these are the boots that Phyllis Wager wore on this expedition in Greenland in the mid-1930s. That means that these are the boots that she's talking about when she talks about her experiences on the expedition in this journal article. And this is one of the real joys of archival research. It's making connections between different parts of the collection and really bringing these people and events alive for the researcher. Now, Phyllis shares a lot of characteristics with her male relatives, colleagues and family. She's white, British, upper class and well educated. That means that it's much easier to find traces of Phyllis in the archives than it is for some of the other women who were on the expedition. And by that I don't mean the other British women who were also accompanying their husbands on the expedition. We hear a lot from them as well. The women that I'm talking about are the Inuit women who were also on the expedition, also with their husbands and families, and whose work was vital to the survival of the expedition in the harsh Greenland winter. This was not unusual to have Inuit families accompanying British expeditions in the Arctic environment. The expeditions drew on their expertise in surviving in this harsh environment. Their work was absolutely vital to the success of any of these given expeditions, and it was quite a common practice to work and collaborate with them in this way. Now, these Inuit families, these Inuit women, are mentioned in sources like the journal articles, though usually not by name. But where they appear most compellingly is in the images recorded of the expeditions. So of the printed photographs and of the lantern slides that we have from the expedition. That shows us that they were there, that they were taking part. We can see some of the work that they were doing, and it makes it clear how much they were a part of this expedition's story. However, what it also means is that we don't hear from them about their experiences on the expedition. We have images of them, but we don't hear their voices. We can hear from Lawrence in his lecture about the expedition, about what he thought about it. We can even hear from Phyllis in this rare speech that's recorded after the lecture, but we don't hear from the Inuit women. And that's one of the more challenging things with archival research. We only have what they left us. And Going back to what we said earlier about how archives are biased and how they reflect particular values of the organisations at the time, that means that certain voices will have been left out and will have been excluded. Were not thought of as being important to record at the time. And that, again, is one of the challenging things about archival work. We have to work with what we've got. But it's definitely possible to reconstruct some of this from the sources that we have available. I really hope you've enjoyed this virtual workshop, and we really look forward to hopefully welcoming you to the Foyle Reading Room in person to do your own research soon.